Hello, everybody. We are continuing on with our next lecture on social code anthropology. As we get a little deeper, I'll tell you guys some stuff. Or sorry, this is a continuation from last time. And as we go on in this, when we end this one, I'll introduce the next section. But it's pretty straightforward. So let's get into it. So last time we left off, right? We talked about how culture is. Hold on, is adaptive, maladaptive, and that kind of links back to the human imagination thing, where essentially, the route that culture takes is not predictable, right? So the reason why adaptive, maladaptive is important in this case is because if it was always adaptive, or always, for the sake of us living longer, or always maladaptive, we would make all of our decisions based off of that one kind of perspective, which we don't. When we make decisions, it's like so many different things that we need to consider, right? And it's the same thing with culture, right? When culture is formed, it doesn't have this one direction. It has like a multitude of directions. Okay, so that's the main point of this one. Again, full circle, it's basically unpredictable. The development of culture, what culture focuses on, is unpredictable. Okay, so moving on to the next portion, right? Universality, generality, and particularity. Anthropologists agree that cultural learning is uniquely elaborated among humans and that all humans have culture. Anthropologists also agree that although individuals differ in their emotional and intellectual tendencies and capacities, all human populations have equivalent capacities for culture, regardless of their genes or their physical appearance. People can learn any culture tradition. So this is very important, okay? The reason why it's important is because a lot of people will tell you that humans are all equal. But when get a little deeper and you ask them why, a lot of people don't really have a good answer, or they have a different answer. For anthropology, and in particular cultural anthropology, it is because we all have the equivalent capacities for culture that we are all equal, right? And yes, like it says in this paragraph, right? Your genes, your physical appearance, your whatever. There's a few things that are limiting in terms, or sorry, not shouldn't limit, that are different in terms of person to person. But overall, if what you are doing is cultural, it can be learned by somebody else. Okay. Now, this is not really this sounds obvious, right? If I learn to dance, you can learn to dance. If I learn how to cook this type of food, you can learn how to cook this type of food, right? Sounds pretty, you know, reasonable. But when you translate this to other things that are cultural, right, that is when things get a little spicy, right? So, for example, do you think that professional sports is cultural? Do you think that college admissions are cultural? Do you think that work opportunities are cultural? These are all things that are cultural, but people might feel different ways about it, right? So, for example, this is my favorite one, right? Let's say you're applying to Harvard as a high schooler going to Harvard. So I don't know if you guys know this, but there are about four things that you need for that application, right? You need your transcripts, your grades. You need an SAT or ACT score. You need recommendations, and finally, you need a personal letter. Okay. Now, aside from that, there are also a few other things. You get interviewed after you get like preliminarily accepted, bunch of stuff. Okay. So, let's start with those first four. So those four things, right? I have a funny story. During COVID, I was trying to look for a side hustle, and I don't know if you guys ever heard of the GRE, but that is a test similar to the SAT, where people who graduate take the GRE in order to get a certain aptitude, reading on their like English and math skills. It's pretty similar to the SAT actually. It's just that it's graduate and it's not as required. But regardless, I was like, let me, apply to tutor in this particular section. And it was like, great. Okay. So I took the practice test and I got a great score. The English, the literature part of it, or the English part of it, I hit like a 90 something percentile, so very high. But for the math portion, I got like under 30% percentile. And so I was like, okay, this is terrible. Let me try the SAT, right? And I did the SAT. The English section, same thing. 90. I think it was above 95. It was pretty high on the 90 on the English side of things. But then I took the math section and get the math section, even though it was better, it was still about 50 percentile. It was pretty bad. Okay. So it's needless to say, I'm not very good at math. Now, you know what's crazy is that if I were to apply to the Harvard undergraduate program, I probably wouldn't get in. Okay. Partially because of my low SAT score, but also for the sake of this argument, let's say I'm not very good at writing personal statements. I'm really good at writing uh research articles or research, what are research assignments, research essays, but I'm not good at writing personal statements. Okay. Let's add on maybe I don't have any professors that I'm close with. Whatever. That's less likely, but let's say that's true. Okay. So what's interesting though is that if I were to apply to the Harvard graduate program in anthropology or in education or in something, I would have a pretty good chance of getting in. Okay. So it's interesting, right? That there, for me, for someone that is obviously, hold on, sorry, there's a cat here. It's interesting that someone who, is qualified in many ways to be in a PhD program or a graduate program at the very least at Harvard University would not be getting into an undergraduate program at the same university. What I'm trying to say with this is that what is the first thing you would say if your friend got into like a good school? Oh, you're so smart. That's the first thing that comes to mind. People are smart. And it's not to say that they aren't smart, but this is a cultural standard, right? It is their standard that you have to write a personal statement in whatever words, like 750 words, really well. It is their standard that you need to score a high score on the SAT, ACT. It is their standard for you to interview well or to write to get these recommendations from your teachers, whatever, right? And it's not to say they're wrong, but it's also not to say that they're right either. There are a lot of people, such as myself, who I think would do very well at a university such as that, especially my current, skill level. I could, I could run circles around a lot of the undergraduate students there, but that's not the point, right? The point is, do I write a personal statement well? Do I have the grades? Do I have the SAT scores? Okay. Now, while that might be their standard, it is not indicative, or sorry, it does not show really your intellectual potential or your ability to perform. It does in some ways, but in some ways it doesn't. If they were to change that writing requirement, for example, from a personal statement to a research paper that is 10 pages long, I would probably kill it in that, right? So again, these are different cultural standards for what Harvard looks at for you to get into the to the program. Okay. It is the same way for everything we do in life. Okay. So for a job, right, they have a cultural standard for you to fulfill. And if you do not fit into that cultural standard, you are not going to get that job. Okay. Now, the thing about this is that it is, we'll talk about that later on, actually, in the ethnocentrism portion. But so anyway, so that's what that comes down to, right? Is that because Harvard values these four things, those are the four things that you need to do in order to get in. If you don't do these four things, then you're not going to get in. It's that simple, right? And that is a example of cultural standards, right? And I would argue, and some people might find this controversial, I do not, that when we talk about equivalent capacities for culture, it is very easy to get into Harvard if you have the resources, right? And a lot of people, it's funny, a lot of people think that the resources just means money. That's part of it, but a lot of it is also understanding what your kid might need to focus on in order to get to Harvard, right? If, for example, you are asking your kid to focus on getting, this has happened a lot, just getting good grades. Yeah, I mean that'll help a little bit, but is it more important for your kid to have good grades, or is it important for them to also be the captain of the wrestling team? Right? Is it important for them to take classes on how to write a personal statement? Is it important for them to take classes from Kaplan or something to do really well in the SAT score? Okay, so these are all different ways in which people do find their way to do well in that system, right? Harvard. Okay. Now let me give you another example. And this one you guys might be less familiar with. When you watch TV, when you watch professional fighters, right? Specifically boxing and MMA, or specifically boxing, MMA, and Muay Thai, that's the ones I watch. You have to ask yourself, is this person on TV really the best fighter that's out there? A lot of times it's not, right? A lot of times it's the person that knows how to cut weight well, right? They can cut weight and regain their weight without having too many health issues. A lot of times it's the person that knows the promotion through one person or another, right? The coach might have a famous fighter, and you are just happen to be with that same coach, and the coach asks the promoter, like, "Hey, man, can you let my guy in?" You get in there, you do well, right? It could be that you have a style that the promotion is very intriguing with, right? Or very intrigued with, right? You might like to stand there and bang. It's very exciting. You have a lot of people buying tickets to your shows. It doesn't necessarily mean you'll win, but you have an exciting show for everyone. It could be that you handle the bright lights really well, right? When you're fighting in front of people, you just you can perform. Whatever it is that person necessarily the best fighter out there? Probably not. I'm sure. Now, again, I'm not as familiar with these different sports, but I'm sure it's the same thing in the NBA, the NFL, the NHL, everything, right? Where it's not just about skill, it's about do you know how to get in, right? And that is what we're talking about. When we're talking about the cultural standard, right? When we're talking about people have equivalent capacities for culture, that means that is talking about different cultural standards we have and that anyone can learn those standards, right? I can, for those of you that are familiar with these types of sports, it is a lot easier for you to, let's say, guide a young person into becoming a professional football player if you've been through that route. If you've never been through that route, it's tough, right? I can tell you if you're a kid and you want to be like a professional fighter, there's a lot of things that I can share with you that will put you on that road. But likewise, if I was unfamiliar with the fight life, so to speak, this fight sports, I wouldn't know where to start, right? And that in itself is an example of being unfamiliar with the cultural standards of what it is to be a fighter. Does that make sense? Okay, I know that's a very long example, but the main point is that, right, when anthropologists talk about people being equal, this is what we're talking about. They have the equal capacities for cultural learning, right? Whatever dance, whatever language, whatever anything that we learn, anything that's cultural can be learned by another person. And that is why, as humans, we are equal. Okay. Now, let's move on. So, this is very interesting. Cultural rules provide guidance on what to do and how to do it, but people don't always do what these rules say should be done. People use their culture actively and creatively rather than blindly following dictates. Anthropologists find it useful to distinguish between ideal and real culture. Okay, so when we're talking about this, right, this is very important because I it is easy to just think that, oh, people follow the rules of culture. That's not true. Think of culture as a frame. Or if you guys, well, I know this is an old example, but if you guys ever played pinball, right? You know the little things in the middle that the pinball bounces off of. Okay, that is a good example too, right? Where people do things within this frame, within this pinball machine, but how they react to those things is very different, right? And again, I'll use the same examples I did, I think, earlier in the semester, where where people having sex before they're married. Most cultures, a lot of cultures, say that it is inappropriate for you to have sex before you're married. Does that mean that no one has sex before they're married? Of course not. But what it does do is that it changes the way in which you react to having sex in those types of cultures, right? Sorry, your behavior after you've had sex before getting married in those types of cultures, right? So, like an example would be, if you're not supposed to have sex before you're married and you end up doing it, you might feel ashamed, you might not want to tell anybody, you might want to hide, whatever, right? That is a behavior influenced by the cultural rule of not having sex before getting married. Okay. So the reason why this is important, okay, is because when we are talking about research, right, there are two types of cultures that we like to kind of distinguish between ideal culture and real culture. Ideal culture consists of what people say they should do and what they say they do. And real culture refers to their actual behavior as observed by the anthropologists. So this is very important because ideal culture oftentimes are the goals or what people think they should do, right? And real culture is what is actually done, right? So in reality, for example, a lot of companies, the ideal culture, right? What they say they do is they let their workers take, however many, like a month off for vacation a year, right? But the real culture is, yeah, that kind of is true, but anyone that takes over 3 weeks gets kind of like a dirty look from the boss. And I think they're on their, their fire list or whatever, right? Ideal culture could be, oh, I come to class, I'm ready to learn, I'm excited every day, right? And real culture could be, sometimes I'm tired when I come to class. These are things that anthropology has to distinguish between, because when people are asked certain questions, it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to answer truthfully. And we're assuming that, right? So, like, for example, if I were to ask you, hey, is this class really boring? The way you would answer that question, even if the answer is the same, will come out very differently if you're talking to me versus if you're talking to your friend, right? And so that's why it's important to distinguish between the two, because sometimes people will say things they think they think they should say, and what is actually happening is something very different. And that is why interviews are not the only source of information for anthropologists. Oftentimes, that's why I have to do ethnography, which we talked about last time, because by being with people and following them and knowing their day-to-day things, we have a better understanding of how they would think about or react to certain things. Okay. Or sorry, how they would think about or react to certain, depending on their cultural background. Okay, great. So ethnocentrism and cultural relativism. Okay, ethnocentrism is the tendency to view one's own culture as superior and to apply one's own cultural values in judging the behavior and beliefs of people raised in other cultures, right? Cultural relativism is the opposite of that. Cultural relativism is the viewpoint that behavior in one culture should not be judged by the standards of another culture. Now, this seems very obvious, right? So ethnocentrism it's a very easy thing to kind of identify, right? It's like when, like the KKK, right? They think their culture is superior, and so they want to kill everyone, or they want everyone to be of their culture, right? So, yeah, that's an easy example. But we don't understand. But one thing I want to tell you though is ethnocentrism exists everywhere in much smaller ways, and it's not necessarily bad. It's just the result of um how culture works, right? So, for example, the Harvard example is a great example of being ethnocentric, right? They want you to follow these cultural norms, which is in the example I gave were those four things, right? SAT score, personal essay, recommendations, and GPA. If you do not follow those four things, they will look at you as not qualified to be there. And also, more importantly, people will look at you, I don't know, as like you're not as smart, let's say. That is an example of ethnocentrism. Okay. So it happens a lot. It could be very simple. It could be just you. Let's say we're on a train. You were raised that on the train, you are very quiet. And then there's a bunch of kids that get on the train and they're loud, right? In your head, you're like, you know what? Those kids, they're troublemakers. They're uneducated. They're, the parents and teacher, whatever. That judgment is the ethnocentric part, right? Where it's like, instead of just saying like, oh, hey, these kids were raised to think that it's okay to speak loudly on the train, and then that's it. You start moving towards like, oh, you know why they're like that? It's because, they're bad people, whatever, right? So ethnocentrism happens a lot. Okay. Now, cultural relativism is the opposite of that, right? It's the viewpoint that behavior in one culture should not be judged by the standards of another culture, right? So, again, in the train example, right? If you were just like, oh, some people are raised and it's okay to speak loud on the train. I wasn't raised that way, but that's okay. That would be a culturally relativistic way of looking at that behavior. Okay. Now, there are certain mechanisms of cultural change. The fusion of traits between cultures, right? That's just basically when cultures meet each other. And remember, when you think about cultures meeting each other, I know in your mind you're thinking of people like from different like places meeting each other, like very distant, like groups of people. But it could be as simple as a family having dinner with another family. You are being exposed to another culture, right? Like on the same block. It doesn't need to be like from a faraway land or anything. Okay. Acculturation is the ongoing exchange of cultural features that result when groups have continuous firsthand contact. Acculturation has a little bit of, well, it's not all the time, but basically when there's ongoing exchange of cultural features is unfortunately a clean example would be like colonized countries, right? Where they might be speaking language A, but because country B came over and colonized them, the people of country A not only need to know or not only know their own language, but they're learning like the language of country B, right? Or the culture of country B, the same thing. And so when you have that continuous contact, you end up creating a new kind of culture, right? An example here is Pidgin. If you guys ever heard of Pidgin languages, they are languages that are linked that have no native speakers. So again, the clearest example is country A gets colonized by country B, and because country A has this continuous firsthand contact with country B, whether it's trying to make a living or going to school or talking to people, they have created a new language, which is country A, or which is a language AB, whatever, right? Examples of Pidgin languages are things like Creole or Patois. These are all examples. Okay. Now, independent invention is the process by which humans innovate, creatively finding solutions to problems. This is pretty obvious, right? When people think of things. If you're into politics, the notion of breaking up districts to benefit your cause, right? So if I know if I divide this neighborhood this way, they're gonna vote my way, then I'll get more points, that is called gerrymandering. And gerrymandering is a great example of independent invention because that only can exist here where the voting system is this way. If the voting system was based off of something else, like I don't know, like shoot, I don't even know. But if they were so right now they're based off districts, let's say, right? If they were not based off of districts, gerrymandering would look very different, right? But anyways, because of gerrymandering, it's changed the whole landscape of politics, and that is another example of cultural change, right? Finally, globalization, a series of processes that work transnationally to promote change in a world in which nations and people are increasingly interlinked, mutually dependent. International commerce, finance, travel, tourism, international migration, and media. So this is twofold. One thing is, the world is essentially becoming smaller in the sense that it's more accessible, right? You can fly a plane very easily to another country. You can drive. Nowadays there are boats and everything. Back in the day, if you wanted to travel across, the sea to China, it'd take like a 6-week voyage. Now it takes like 13 hours. It's nothing. Okay. And that has changed the culture of our entire world significantly. Even like the notion of even just like the internet or like, computers and iPhones. Back in the day, like if you wanted to learn something about China, you'd have to go to the library and like check out a book and just read it. It's not even anything you don't even know if necessarily you'd be interested in that thing and you read about it, right? But nowadays you just Google Chinese cultural things, and then what's his name? iShowSpeed is gonna pop up with his tour to China, right? And they have a lot of glimpses of what it's like to live there. And in the past, it was not this way, and because of this, it's become much more common, right? Um, so yeah, so these are the four kind of ways in which culture changes, right? Again, cultures meeting each other, the kind of like forced interaction between two different cultures, independent invention, and finally globalization. Okay, so full circle, right? What is the main difference between something that is natural, something that is cultural? Something that is natural is something that you could say is biologically passed on, and something that is cultural is something that's learned, right? So keep that in mind when we're talking about in the future. But if you think of it that way, um, there are so many things in our lives that are very cultural. Okay. All right. So we're going to close this out. Let me share a different screen. Oh, wait. Hold on. This one. Yes. All right. Very good. Okay. So today, in this particular lecture, we're going to be going over chapter 16. Continuing on, this is going to specifically talk about race, ethnicity, and nationality. Real quickly, well, why don't you just read the? I'm gonna keep you guys up to date because there's some stuff because of timing. Read the announcements and the emails, and they'll keep you up with what's going on. Definitely finish the quiz though. All right, so we're gonna watch this, and I want you to think about some of the things that we're gonna talk about here. Okay, so this is the where's the, sorry, give me 1 second. This is the, this one. So this is a video on race, ethnicity, and nationality. One thing though I want you to do is, if it's not very clear on your screen, which might get really choppy, I want you to watch it separately. It only takes like, you know, it only takes like a few minutes. Let me make sure that my share has the, there we go. Okay. Very good. Oh, okay, very good. All right. So I'm going to mute myself.
Race, ethnicity, and nationality are three terms that get thrown around a lot, and all too often they're used interchangeably, ignored, or just used incorrectly. But each of these words actually has a very distinct meaning, and I'm going to talk about them today using my favorite candy, jelly beans. Let's start with race. Now, you may have heard someone say, race is a human construct, and that's true. Race is a mode of categorization that's based on physical appearance. So in the case of jelly beans, race is color. Because race is based on appearance, to some degree it's ascribed, meaning that people are assigned into racial categories based on what other people see. Even if somebody could be mistaken for a certain racial category, it can still apply to them. These categories are fluid, and our ideas of racial groupings change all the time. It's also important to remember that a person can have parents with two different racial backgrounds. The population of the world is becoming increasingly mixed. But even a person with multiple races will still ultimately belong to a racial category themselves, whether or not it's the same as their parents. Race is a huge factor in daily life, but it isn't the whole picture. The term race does not capture the complexities of ethnicity. Ethnicity refers to the ethnic group or groups that a person belongs to. It's a part of a person's heritage and ancestry. In the case of jelly beans, ethnicity is like the flavor. Two people who are in the same racial group can still have very different ethnicities. For example, all of these are red, but this one is cinnamon and this one is cherry. Two people in the same racial group can, and often do, have very different backgrounds. It's important to note that there are some groups who are unable to trace their specific ethnic heritage because of things like slavery, assimilation, and genocide. Ethnicity is a huge part of identity formation and development, but it's still not the same as nationality. The word nationality refers to someone's national origin, the country where they hold citizenship. For jelly beans, it's like the bag that a bean comes from. People of the same race or ethnicity can come from all different nations, like the watermelon bean that's in Camo Mix and Kids Mix, or the lemon lime bean that's in all three. And nationality is flexible. If a person immigrates, their nationality can change. People can have dual citizenship or sometimes no citizenship at all. So, now you know. As a quick recap, race is a mode of categorization based on physical appearance, like the color of a jelly bean. Ethnicity is a person's actual ethnic background based on their ancestry, like the flavor of a jelly bean. And nationality is the place where a person holds citizenship, which is like the jelly bean's bag. Now that you know the difference, you can have a much more comprehensive conversation about identity issues. Thanks for watching! I hope you enjoyed this video because I totally enjoyed eating these jelly beans afterwards.
All right, so that's a pretty good video. Props to her also. I'm pretty sure she's just like doing a project for something, which is a lot of work, for let's see how to open this. For just, for this kind of project. But anyways, so let's talk about it. Real quickly, what is race? And we're gonna go over these actual questions at the end. What is the difference between race, ethnicity, and nationality? Sorry, let me close the. Okay. All right. So, what is the difference between race, ethnicity, and nationality? Right. It's pretty straightforward. Is my picture up? Why can't I see my picture? I'm just gonna assume that my picture's okay. I'm gonna assume my picture's there. It's fine. Anyways, so yeah, so when we're talking about race, right? What is race? Race is the color of the jelly bean, right? That is essentially your physical features. Okay. Ethnicity is what? The flavor of the jelly bean. That is your ethnic heritage, right? Your heritage, country of origin, maybe. And finally, your nationality is where you have citizenship. That is very important. Okay. It is not where you're from, it is your citizenship. Those are three very important distinctions. Okay. So now we're going to go deeper into these. So, ethnicity. Why is my video not showing up? I am concerned about this. Oh, here we go. Okay, gotcha. All right. So, ethnicity is based on cultural similarities with members of the same ethnic group and difference between that group and others. Ethnic groups share certain belief values, habits, customs, and norms because of their common background, right? So, what do they essentially share? They share some notion of culture. Okay. Now, this seems pretty straightforward, right? One thing I want you to pay attention to is that members of the same ethnic group and others, right? So basically, it's not just understanding or having an idea of what someone is, it's also an understanding what they are not, which is a big distinction here. Ethnicity means identification with, feeling part of an ethnic group, and exclusion from certain other groups because of their affiliation. Ethnicity is not only basis of groups like group identity. So right here I have the Puerto Rican parade. It's pretty great. But what's interesting is that, again, it's not just the group that you are a part of or feel part of. It's also groups that you're excluded from. Okay. Now, obviously, ethnicity, while it is one of the big things that we use to identify ourselves, it's not the only form of identity. What is the definition of a minority group? I love this definition. Okay. Minority groups occupy subordinate positions within a social hierarchy. This is important. Inferior power and less secure access to resources than do majority groups. Inferior power and less secure access to resources. So that's very important. It is not to say that certain groups don't have resources. It's just accessing those resources is more difficult than the majority group. Okay. Now, right here in the bottom, we have one. What is the difference between race and ethnicity? Why does this matter, right? Well, race and ethnicity, well, actually, we're going to talk about it more towards the end, but it does matter because when you fall under a certain race, you are assumed to have certain kinds of similarities in your background, but in many ways you might not, right? A good example is in Southern California, there are a group of people, or there are a couple groups of people, the Laotian and the Cambodian people in particular, Long Beach. Okay, they're pretty famous. They face a lot of economic, financial hardships. They face a lot of neighborhood, environmental hardships. They have refugee status. They have a lot of tough things that they have to deal with. And unfortunately, because of their association with being Asian, because they are part of Laos and Cambodia are considered Asian, they are considered as part of the majority, even though they are not, right? They do not benefit from the same, things that East Asians, for example, might benefit from in Southern California, right? So basically what I'm saying is if you are Laotian or Cambodian, a lot of times you might not have access to resources because you're categorized as Asian, right? Um, and that is a big boo-boo because it's like they need the support, but because of something as well, we're talking again, we're talking about the end as random as race, they might not receive this assistance. In addition, when we think about race and ethnicity, right, I think it's important to note that, for example, a recently immigrated family from Jamaica that lives in Flatbush is going to have a very different experience than from a person that is, that has been in America for than a black person that's been in America for like 5 generations and lives in Atlanta or Texas, right? These are very different experiences, but because they are both going to be labeled as black, they will both be put into the same category, which is, pretty inaccurate. Okay. So now let's talk about race. Race is when an ethnic group is assumed to have a biological basis. Race, like ethnicity in general, is a cultural category rather than a biological reality. Popular culture rarely distinguishes between ethnicity and race. So in popular culture, depending on how you use it, race and ethnicity is kind of mixed up. So don't Don't be surprised when it has a different definition than what we have. Most Americans acquire the racial identity at birth, but race isn't based on biology or on simple ancestry. Mixed black children are still black, and many Americans with a Latino or Native grandparent consider themselves white, right? So a lot of people like to think that race has a biological basis. Now, the reason why that is not true in the way that you're thinking is because technically race is biological in the sense that your physical features, right, categorize you into this or that. However, everything past that is cultural. I'm gonna say that again. The only biological part of race are your physical features. Anything past that is cultural. Okay? So any associations you might have with that skin color, with that physical feature, is cultural. Okay? Now, some great examples here. When, for example, in America, I chose these two in particular, right? When you are American, in America, and you are mixed black, when you are mixed black and you have black physical features, even though you're not, even though you're only half black, you are still considered black, right? The greatest example is Drizzy Drake, right? Drizzy Drake is half black and half Jewish. However, he is rarely identified as Jewish. He is often identified as black, and he is accepted by the black community as black, and the American and is labeled by the American community as black, right? That is clear in certain lyrics that he has in his songs. Okay. Now, why aren't we labeling him as Jewish? Right? It's simply because of the way he looks. Does that make sense? Or sorry, not the way he looks. Physical features, which is mostly the way he looks, but there's also other things, right? Rashida Jones and her sister, those are actresses, both have talked about very different experiences in Hollywood because Rashida Jones is more white appearing and her sister is not. And they have very different experiences in Hollywood, right? If race was was mainly based off of biology, then these types of things wouldn't happen, right? If it's half and half, then why are we going with one half? It's because they are not based in biology. They're based in cultural assumptions. Okay. The next thing, many Americans with a Native or Latino grandparent consider themselves white. This is not as common in New York, but where I went to undergrad at, this was very common. There are a lot of Chicanos, Mexican Americans that were in Arizona, and many of those people are not only Mexican American, but Native American or descendants of Native Americans, and because they are physically they pass as white, they just usually a lot of times they just put white on their applications or whatever. Okay. Now, if this is true, if again, if race was biological, this wouldn't be possible, but it is very possible. It would not be the same as me putting white on an application. Why is that? It's because of the physical features. Okay. Very good. Moving on. So, status identity. Cultural differences are also associated with class, region, religion, and other social variables. Individuals often have more than one group identity. In anthropology, status is any position, no matter what the prestige that someone occupies in society. There are ascribed and achieved statuses. Ascribed statuses are statuses that people have limited choice about occupying, and achieved statuses come through choices, actions, efforts, talents, and accomplishments, right? Ascribed statuses. People have limited choice about occupying. The cleanest and easiest example are going to be gender and race. Those two are the easiest things. When you are born, you're given male, female, and then you are expected to live in that particular gender that's associated with male or female. And when you're born, you're also given a race, and you're going to be labeled that race for the rest of your life, right? Now, that being said, this, if you'll read it carefully, people have limited choice about occupying. It doesn't mean that you can't reestablish those things, right? People like Caitlyn Jenner, everyone's heard of Caitlyn Jenner, used to be Bruce Jenner, and now she is Caitlyn Jenner, has changed their gender to she. And for those of you that are maybe aware of this person, Rachel Dolezal, she is a white professor that passes black for a very long time. And she won like all these like, Black Excellence Awards. It was bad. You have time, Google her. It's very interesting. But anyways, those two examples, right? Caitlyn Jenner changed their gender and Rachel Dolezal changed their race. Um, while it is possible, it is very difficult. It is very difficult, right? So just keep that in mind. Now, achieve statuses. One thing I want you to be careful of is when you hear the word achieve, you probably think of positive things. This can also go for negative things, right? You can be a physician, a father. These are all, good things, but you also achieve being a felon. So keep that in mind, right? Ascribed statuses are kind of given to you, and achieved statuses are accomplished or done, right? So now, when we're thinking about these statuses, right? It is not to say that achieved is easy to change, but the way that that goes is that you have to initiate action or something to get it. Ascribed statuses are given to you. Okay, very good. Moving on, situational negotiation, which happens often of social identity, is when one identity is used in certain settings, another in different ones, right? If someone, if so, for example, if you were to fill out a form, you might put Hispanic, and then when someone asks like, "Hey, what's your background?" you might say Mexican, right? That is a great example of situational negotiation. It is literally when you are in different situations, identifying yourself differently. This happens so much during the day, you can't even like really count it. If I were to walk on campus, security guard like, "Hey, what are you doing here?" I'd be like, "I'm a professor," right? If you were to talk to me and oh, actually, that would also be a professor. If I was in class and then you guys asked me what's your background, I'd be like, "Oh, I'm Chinese." If I was filling out a form, for Kingsborough about my demographic information, I'd probably put Asian. If I was traveling to another country and they asked me what my background was, I'd probably say American, right? These are all different ways I identify myself depending on the situation. Okay, very good. So, racial attitudes in Japan illustrate intrinsic racism, and Brazil has their own different perspective on discrimination. Now, we as America look at race, ethnicity, and nationality in a certain way. We have historical ties with the ways that we look at it, but it does not mean that the whole world looks at it this way. So, for example, in Japan, the belief, they do not they think that the discrimination that Americans have towards black people is ridiculous, right? It's unfounded. It's like, why would you discriminate against them based off of the color of skin, whatever. They think it's stupid, right? They think it's kind of crazy. However, that being said, Japan has its own form of discrimination, which is intrinsic racism. They discriminate against the group called the Burkumin and the Koreans. The belief that a perceived racial difference is okay to value someone less, discrimination come in the form of dresses and marriage investigators. They're considered unclean. So Korean people, if you haven't looked at a map, Korea is very close to Japan. There's a lot of people from Korea that live in Japan. They are pretty heavily discriminated against. They're thought of as less than and unclean. However, the Burkumin, this is the very interesting one. The Burkumin are a class of untouchables from the 13th century Tokugawa period. This is what I had to look up. And obviously, because racially and ethnically they are Japanese, how can you tell that they are part of the Burikumin class? They were part of the Burikumin class because it's so long ago. Well, what they do is before you get married, they have like a marriage investigator investigate your family and your addresses where you used to live and see if you're connected. To us, to me at least, that sounds a little crazy, kind of stupid, but we have to understand that the way that we discriminate in our country seems stupid to them. So again, the way that race and ethnicity is perceived internationally is very different than it is in America. Okay, it's not better or worse, it's just different. Brazil, they have exclusionary racial systems they do not have exclusionary racial systems. They do have, however, discrimination against like geographic parts of the country. Also, this is not a good example because actually more recently there has been research coming out talking about how Brazil is discriminatory towards people of different, colors essentially, right? Different shades. Yeah, it's pretty messed up. Anyways, what they're trying to say though here is that discrimination occurs here in the form or in when they discriminate against people, it's based off of their geographic location. So in Brazil, in particular, Nordestinos, people from the northeast, are thought of as lacking culture, as being like kind of like country bumpkins. They don't know how it is to live in the city, whatever. That is, in this example, the way that Brazil discriminates. And again, the both of these examples are here just to show you that in different countries, discrimination and the understanding of race is very different. In the past, nation was synonymous with ethnic groups, right? So in the past, like basically, when you and even now today actually, but when you say like for example Chinese culture, you're talking about a different country, right? When you say Korean culture, you're talking about Korean culture. We're talking about Mexican culture. You're talking about the nation, not only the nation but also the culture. But because after all this time, like people live in different places. Unfortunately, there's conquest and colonialism. A lot of states are not culturally homogenous, meaning that there are a lot of people living everywhere, right? So, while in the past the nation had a more heavy association with the culture, now it's more and more becoming just a place, like just literally, hey, the place of America, the place of Korea, the place of China, the place of Mexico. Now, what's interesting though is there are certain, I just had this in there because this is interesting. There is an example of ethnic groups of the same ethnic group that seeks autonomous political status, meaning that they have a different political status as their same ethnic group, right? The example here is North and South Korea, especially when they split up. Now it's a little bit different, but when they split up that time, their cultures are essentially the same. But because of political differences, they became different countries. So you could say that despite their ethnicity being the same, which is Korean, right? Their political statuses are different. Like literally their citizenship is different, their nationality. Okay, so that's just a good example. All right, so ethnic tolerance and accommodation. So assimilation is the process of change members of an ethnic group may experience when they move to a country where another culture dominates. Assimilation is basically when someone is sacrificing previous cultural values for new cultural values, and it's like it has like a forced vibe to it, right? So because I have to work this way in this new country, I cannot pray in the morning, right? You're sacrificing previous things for new things. And the word sacrifice is very important, right? It's not necessarily a I want to let go, it's more of I have to let go kind of thing. But this isn't always the case. This doesn't have to be the case. And a great example is actually New York. New York is something called a plural society, which combines ethnic contrast and economic interdependence between ethnic groups, right? Plural societies are basically societies that have ethnic enclaves within their city or within their country or whatever, there where they can kind of like exist, okay, and do their own thing. Now, the reason why, so what does that look like, right? In New York City, how does it work? I don't know if you have ever paid attention, but for example, in places like Chinatown or even Brighton Beach or Flatbush, right? There are services in, for example, in Chinatown, there are services for medical services, dental services, tax services, lawyer services, whatever, in Chinese for the American system, right? Obviously, they're not paying taxes to China, they're paying taxes to America. But because the people there speak Chinese, they can help other people who speak Chinese file their taxes, for example, right? If someone needs to go to court, obviously they're going to court in America, but they're having a lawyer that understands Chinese or can provide their services somehow in Chinese, so that they can communicate, whatever, right? That is an example. That is the exact same thing in Brighton Beach for a lot of the Russian residents as well, or sorry, Russian speaking residents, and as well as in in Flatbush, a lot of Creole, Patois, whatever, right? These are plural societies, and it's not just language; it's everything, right? But those are the easiest examples, right? And remember, it is important that these languages are being spoken, ironically, to fulfill something within our own society, right? Taxes, medical checkups, law stuff. These are all services that these plural societies provide in a different language and cultural context than normally. Or sorry, than other places in America. Okay, and that's a plural society. Now, the view of cultural diversity is good as multiculturalism. The seeks way to understand and interact that don't depend on sameness, but rather on respect for differences. Let's talk about the salad versus the melting pot. A lot of people like to say that New York City is a melting pot of cultures. The reason why that's not a great demonstration of multiculturalism is because if you ever cooked before, when you put everything into a melting pot, it all kind of tastes the same. Like if you make a stew, like yeah, you can eat a potato or yeah, you can eat a piece of meat, but it kind of tastes all the same. The difference between a salad and melting pot is when you eat a salad, let's say you have tomatoes, lettuce, onions, whatever, right? When you eat that tomato, it is very clearly a tomato. You still have like it's still very much a tomato taste, right? It has its own distinct taste. But all those different ingredients are kind of brought together by the dressing, which in this case, in the analogy, is maybe the country or the society, right? So when we think about looking at cultural diversity as a good thing, we should think about more of a salad and less of a melting pot because it's okay to be different. All right, so full circle, right? So I want you to think about, right? We kind of learned a little bit more about race, ethnicity, nationality, especially with the jelly bean thing. When do you really need to interact with race, ethnicity, nationality, right? Um, and this might surprise you, but what it really comes down to, on terms of like a more technical basis, is when you're filling out forms. When you're filling out forms to come to Kingsborough, we fill out forms to transfer to university, when filling out forms to go to the airport, whatever, right? Are you, that being said, when you're thinking about these interactions, do you ever wonder when you put down your race or ethnicity, does it really reflect your background, right? And this moves on to the last question. What does the culture anthropology say about these categories? What's interesting is that a lot of people look at these categories as kind of like absolute truths, but in reality, they are not. They are culturally set categories. It doesn't mean that they're any more or less true or whatever. But what it does mean is that these are categories created for the time where you need to have these categories. So, for example, I might have to put Chinese down as my cultural background, but my cultural, be having been raised here, and my parents honestly having been raised here as well, is my cultural background going to be the same as someone from China that just came 2 years ago? Probably not, right? Um, Again, when we talk about like the example I gave earlier, if you are a Jamaican immigrant and you just came here a year ago or 2 years ago versus a family in Atlanta that's lived there for 5 generations, they're both black. Should they be put in the same category? Probably not, right? So from a cultural anthropologist perspective, these categories are just that. They're categories, right? A lot of people love using them for statistics and stuff like that. But you need to ask yourself, like, how accurate are these descriptions of people? And a lot of times the cultural background might mislead you, which actually we're going to get into in the next section, might mislead you more than provide you any important information about the person that you're trying to describe. Okay. So, anyways, I hope you find that a little interesting. As always, if you have any questions, please shoot me an email at raymond.fong@kbcc.cuny.edu.